In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the breakup of Standard Oil, the largest company in the world. John D. Rockefeller controlled more than 90% of oil refining in the country. He set prices. He eliminated competitors. He negotiated secret deals with railroad companies so his rivals would pay higher shipping rates. The government argued that Standard Oil did not compete in the market. It was the market. And a market controlled by a single company is not a market. It is a monopoly. That case established a principle that is still alive today, when the European Union finds Google or the United States investigates Amazon. Markets do not regulate themselves. Someone has to write the rules. And the hardest question is not whether rules are needed, but which ones, how many, and who writes them. In the two previous episodes we saw the two great levers of the state, monetary policy, which acts on interest rates and the money supply, and fiscal policy, which acts on taxes and spending. But there is a third way the government shapes the economy, less visible but equally powerful. Regulation. The rules that determine what can be sold, how competition works, what information must be disclosed, what risks can be taken, and which are prohibited. Today we are going to walk through the history and logic of economic regulation. What problems it tries to solve, what problems it creates, and why the debate between more regulation and less regulation never fully resolves. The economic justification for regulation starts with a concept we already covered in earlier seasons: market failure. Markets work well in many circumstances, but not all. Monopolies are the most obvious failure. When a single company dominates a market, it can raise prices, lower quality, and block the entry of competitors. The consumer loses. Efficiency declines. Innovation stagnates. Externalities are another failure. When a factory pollutes a river, it imposes a cost on the neighbors that is not reflected in the price of its products. The market does not see that cost. Environmental regulation tries to make it visible. Asymmetric information is a third. When the seller knows something the buyer does not, for example that a medication has serious side effects, the market cannot function well because one party is making decisions with incomplete information. Labeling regulations, drug agencies, and financial transparency rules try to correct this imbalance. Finally, systemic risk. When the failure of one company can drag down the entire system, as happened with banks in 2008, the individual interest of each firm, maximizing its profit, can be incompatible with the stability of the whole. Prudential regulation tries to prevent individual risks from becoming collective catastrophes. Modern economic regulation was born in the United States in the late 19th century, as a direct response to the power of the great monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was the first federal law prohibiting agreements to restrain competition and attempts to monopolize a market. It was vague and difficult to enforce, but it established the principle: the state has the right and the duty to protect competition. After the Great Depression, regulation expanded dramatically. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banking from investment banking. The idea was simple: the bank where you deposit your savings should not use that money to gamble on the stock market. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate securities markets. Transparency requirements for publicly traded companies were established. In Europe, regulation followed a different but parallel path. European welfare states regulated labor markets, prices, and access to basic services intensively. The European Economic Community, and later the European Union, added a supranational layer of regulation that harmonized standards across countries. The result was a period, from the 1940s to the 70s, where regulation was extensive and the economy grew strongly. Defenders of regulation point to this era as proof that regulated markets can be prosperous. Critics respond that the economy grew despite regulation, not because of it, and that the real drivers were post-war reconstruction and technological innovation. In the 1980s, as we saw in the episode on neoliberalism, the trend reversed. Financial deregulation was the most significant. In 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act repealed Glass-Steagall, once again allowing commercial banks, investment banks, and insurers to merge. Defenders argued that the separation was an anachronism preventing American financial firms from competing globally. Critics warned that the barrier protecting the system from excessive risk was being removed. Deregulation was not limited to finance. Telecommunications, airlines, energy, and transportation were liberalized in many countries. In some cases, the results were positive. Airline deregulation in the United States significantly lowered ticket prices. In other cases, the results were disastrous. Energy deregulation in California contributed to the electricity crisis of 2000 and 2001, with blackouts and price manipulation by companies like Enron. The financial crisis of 2008 was a turning point. The financial deregulation that had allowed the proliferation of toxic products, excessive leverage, and opacity was identified as a central cause of the disaster. The legislative response was the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States, passed in 2010. More than 2,000 pages of new regulations. Mandatory stress tests for large banks. Restrictions on proprietary trading. Creation of new supervisory agencies. Higher capital requirements. Internationally, the Basel III agreements raised the capital requirements that banks must hold as a buffer against losses. The central idea is straightforward: if a bank has more of its own capital at stake, it will make more prudent decisions. Did these reforms work? The answer is partial. The financial system is more resilient than it was in 2007. Banks have more capital. Stress tests detect vulnerabilities. But critics note that post-crisis regulation did not solve the fundamental problem of banks too big to fail. The largest financial institutions are bigger today than before the crisis. In the third decade of the 21st century, the regulatory debate has shifted toward the big technology companies. Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft dominate entire markets with a concentration of power reminiscent of the 19th century monopolies. The European Union has led technology regulation. The General Data Protection Regulation, known as GDPR, came into force in 2018 and became the global standard for digital privacy. The Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act go further, imposing specific obligations on large platforms. In the United States, the approach has been more litigious and less legislative. The Department of Justice sued Google for monopoly in search. The Federal Trade Commission sued Meta. But comprehensive legislation equivalent to the European laws has not materialized. The underlying debate is familiar. Defenders of technology regulation argue that platforms are natural monopolies that exploit personal data, distort competition, and accumulate power no private company should have. Critics respond that these companies innovate at a pace regulation cannot keep up with, and that over-regulating will kill the golden goose. There is a risk that affects all regulation, regardless of intent. It is called regulatory capture, and it is one of the most important concepts in political economy. The idea is simple. Regulated industries have an enormous incentive to influence those who regulate them. They hire the best lawyers. They fund political campaigns. They offer jobs to regulators when they leave office, the so-called revolving door. Over time, the regulator stops serving the public interest and starts serving the interest of the regulated. George Stigler, a Chicago school economist, formalized this idea in 1971. His conclusion was provocative: regulation, in practice, usually benefits the industries it claims to control. Not always, but often enough that the problem is systemic. This does not mean all regulation is captured. But it does mean that institutional design matters as much as the content of the law. Independent regulators with their own funding, mandatory transparency, and strict revolving door prohibitions produce better results than weak regulators funded by the government of the day and permeable to industry pressure. Regulation seems abstract. But it determines the price of what we buy, the safety of what we eat, the cleanliness of the air we breathe, the stability of the bank where we deposit our savings. When regulation works well, it is invisible. Nobody thinks about food safety standards when eating at a restaurant. Nobody thinks about bank capital requirements when withdrawing money from an ATM. Effective regulation is regulation you do not notice. When it fails, the consequences are visible and sometimes devastating. Medications with hidden side effects. Contaminated food. Banks that collapse and drag the savings of millions with them. Industrial pollution that destroys entire communities. For the ordinary person, the question should not be whether we want regulation or not. It should be whether the regulation we have is well designed, whether it serves the public or the regulated, and whether it adapts to the new risks that constantly emerge. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, economic regulation exists because markets fail in specific circumstances: monopolies, externalities, asymmetric information, and systemic risk. It is not a question of more or less state, but of which rules produce the best results for society as a whole. Second, history oscillates between regulatory and deregulatory waves. The post-crisis regulation of the 1930s was dismantled from the 80s onward. Deregulation contributed to the 2008 crisis. The re-regulation that followed has strengthened the system but not solved all problems. Today, the new battleground is technology regulation. Third, regulatory capture is a real risk. Industries tend to influence those who regulate them. Designing independent, transparent regulators resistant to pressure is as important as writing good laws. Governments regulate, collect taxes, and spend. But the largest spending item in most countries goes to something very specific: the social safety net. Healthcare, pensions, unemployment, education. How these systems work, how much they cost, and whether they are sustainable. Next time.